Good morning, girls. Hope you all are bright as the sun today. Welcome to my class. So, we're going to continue with the chapter 2. There were a few topics that were left out, right? So, we're going to conclude that today. And by saying that, let me recap for the previous things what we have learned. So, previously, girls, we have studied about the trade and industry, where industry and trade. So there we studied public and private sectors in Indian industrial development. Then industrial policy resolution, which is also called as IPR 1956, because the policy was introduced in this particular year 1956. There we studied about the regional equality. Then small scale industry, we saw how the small scale industry was trying to grow in that particular time frame. And today we're going to start with the trade policy, girls. So we need to learn how the trade policies helped the development of the economy. So we shall see that, okay? So trade policy was more into the import substitution. So what is this import substitution? So in the first 7 plans, trade was characterized by what is commonly called as inward looking trade strategy. Girls, now I want you all to understand what is inward looking trade strategy. With this inward looking trade strategy is also called as import substitution. So technically this strategy is called as import substitution. This policy aimed at replacing or substituting imports with domestic production. So here the government's main intention, the Indian government's main intention was to cut down the imports, to stop taking things from other countries instead of borrowing things from other countries or buying things from other countries or importing goods and services from other countries. The government decided to produce the goods and services in our own country with the available resources. So, the domestic production was encouraged. Here, the main intention behind was to develop or to encourage the developing industries in the country. So, in this policy, the government protected the domestic industries from foreign competition. So this became a major criteria. Though now if you keep importing goods and services from a different country, what happens? You're giving a chance for the other foreign countries companies to grow in our country. There will be a later stage where those companies can come into our country and start their production. Rather than all this to happen, our government decided to do the domestic production, which was more wise as India was self-contained. It was everything was available. All the raw materials were available in the country, and henceforth the manpower is in excess. So, with using all this, India had to decide to develop or to start the manufacturing domestically. The production had to happen domestically. This was the main reason behind the import substitution. And also, the protection from imports took two forms, that is, tariffs and quotas. Here, girls, I want you to understand when you are importing goods and services from a different country, you will have to pay the foreign currency. You will have to pay in the foreign currency. You can't pay in Indian rupees, isn't it? Because that is not their money. Their money is, say, for example, I'm importing, say, silk from China or Japan, and what is the currency? So whatever their currency is, yen or the China currency, I'll have to pay in that particular currency. I cannot pay rupees. So when I am continuously buying from a different country, what happens? I'll have to spend more number of rupees where my rupee value is going down in front of the other country's currency. Here, when I am doing this kind of trade, I exhaust my reserves, my foreign reserves, which is not good for the economy. When I exhaust or when I empty my foreign reserves or foreign exchange currencies, whatever I have kept in reserve, that is, I being India has kept in reserve. What happens? India has to borrow it from a different, probably from a financial organizations, from external foreign, for finance. I'll have to depend on a different country for excess money. So this becomes a burden on the economy, which is not right. For seeing all this, our policymakers decided to have two important forms during the import trade. What were they? They were tariffs and quotas. What are tariffs? So, tariffs are a tax on imported goods. So, there is a particular tax. Whatever you import, it comes with tax, isn't it? So, when our government started to increase the tax or started to charge a tax on certain import items, so the imported goods became more expensive. So, when the imported goods became more expensive, people started to reduce buying the goods from import. They started to reduce importing goods because it is expensive. So, this discouraged the use of import trade. Next was quotas. Quotas specify the quantity of goods which can be imported. So government imposed quotas. So only this many number of goods or this quantity should only be imported. So when there was a certain regulation, certain conditions, only this much, only these many numbers. So when it was a restriction made, so that became it started to decline. The import rate started to decline gradually. So, the effect of tariffs and quotas is that they restrict imports and therefore protect the domestic firms from foreign competition. So, again, the welfare of the domestic industries were taken care by our policymakers by introducing the tariffs and the quotas. So, keeping all this in mind, one should trade. So, this became a major impact on the import trade. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, the policy of protection is based on the notion that industries of developing countries are not in a position to compete against the goods produced by more developed economies. So, the basic reason behind was to protect the developing countries. So, industries in the developing countries had to be pushed, they needed some kind of support. So they could compete against the goods produced by the developed economies only through this kind of policies. Okay, so it is assumed that if the domestic industries are protected, they will learn to compete in the course of time. So, girls, here you need to understand any startup company. India being a developing country during that particular period of time, it was just taking birth. The industrial sectors were taking birth during that time frame, and it was very difficult for India to make the survival for industrial sectors because there were huge number of competitions happening, and they didn't know how to make use of the resources that was available. So what happened? They needed some support. So by what to say, discouraging the imports, by creating the import substitution, they started to encourage the domestic industry. The policymakers were least bothered about what we export. They were just bothered about how the domestic industries could sustain, how they could stabilize in our economy. They were just bothered for stabilization. Once the stabilization was done, the competition level and the confidence in the industries, the industrialist would grow gradually. This was the main aim behind import substitution. Our planners feared the possibility of foreign exchange being spent on import of luxury goods if no restrictions were placed on imports. As I said you about the foreign exchange, the amount of reserves what we have as foreign exchange, if we would overspend on the import goods, then we wouldn't have any balance left out. So what will happen in turn, we'll start borrowing money funds from different financial institutions from different companies of which belongs to different countries, not even India. India didn't have anywhere to produce revenue because India was running out of finance. It was increasing in debt. So this became a huge burden on the economy. So that was a major fear in the policymakers. Now let us see what was the effect of policies on industrial development. The achievements of India's industrial sector during the first seven plans were very impressive indeed. It was good, the growth was good compared to the industrial development during the eve of colonial rule. That is, during the British rule, what was the industrial state situation was much better when it was, I mean, now, that is during 1990s, the industrial development was better compared to the eve of independence or the colonial rule. So now, what happened? The proportion of GDP contributed by the industrial sector increased in the period from 11.8%. Okay, this was during the period of what to say, the colonial rule. It was 11.8%. Okay, that is 1950 to 1951. So it increased from 11.8% to 24.6%, which was a drastic change, which was a huge number. That was a, it indicates a growth. Okay, so this happened during the year of 1990 to 1991. So there's a rise in GDP, which is an important indicator of development. The Indian industrial sector became well diversified largely due to public sector. So due to the public sector, there was lot of diversification. What is diversification? Diversification is producing goods and services in variety. So they are producing in all the fields. Understood? So for an example for diversification is Himalaya. It's a company. Himalaya is a company where they produce so many products. They produce medicines, they produce creams, they produce soaps, oil. So it's like a wide range of variety. So it's just not one product. All right. So, the promotion of small scale industries gave opportunities to those who did not have the capital to start large firms to get into business. So, people who wanted to start business in large scale operations, they didn't have an opportunity. So they had an opportunity to start with the small scale industries, because small scale industries were also being encouraged to develop. They were encouraged to function in various localities, various developing areas. Okay, the production of foreign competition enabled the development of indigenous industries in the areas of electronics and automobile sectors, which otherwise could not have developed. So the foreign competition was, it encouraged the indigenous industries in the areas of electronics and automobiles. Next is a telecommunication service continued to be reserved by the for the public sector, even after it was realized that the private sector firms could also provide it. So, girls, what do you understand by this point? Telecommunication. So, which is the telecommunication company which is owned or which is operated as a public sector? Yes, it is BSNL. So even today, BSNL is a public sector company which is owned and operated by our Indian government, isn't it? So there was a large amount of discussion happening. Who has to do what? How? Which part of sector should be handled by the public or which has to be handled by private. This became a major discussion amongst all the policy makers. So on this basis they started to think, the policy makers. So after 4 decades of planned development of Indian economy, no distinction was made between what the public sector alone can do and what the private sector can also do. So now you understand, public sector are those industries which are owned and operated by the government of India, and private sector are owned and operated privately by individuals or partners. All right. So, this led some scholars to argue that the state should get out of areas which the private sector can manage, and the government may concentrate its resources on important services which the private sector cannot provide. So here they concluded that yes, there is certain areas which has to be done, which has to be focused by the private sectors, and certain companies or industries should be run by public sector or the government. Moving on to the next. So many public sector firms incurred huge losses. Losses were unbearable but still continued to operate because it was difficult to close a government undertaking, even if it is a drain on the nation's limited resources. For this, an example is the ITI company or the HAL companies. So these are all running under losses, but still they're operating, still they're functioning. Why? Because they're government owned. Even though there's a huge amount of loss or debt, the government bears it because they can't shut down such a huge industry. Why? Because number of people involved in it as an employment employers, as the people, different countries believe in this public sector, they cannot shut down something just like that because just it has number of deaths. It can recover with certain time limit, time frame given. So the need to obtain a license to start a industry was misused by the industrial houses. A big industrialist would get a license not for starting a new firm but to prevent competitors from starting new firms. So this became a new strategies run by the um, you know those industrialists who had a lot of money. They wanted to just go and buy a license and start a company so that the small companies which are functioning, they should not be operating. So they wanted to cut down the competition, so they started to move on into a next level of industrial sector by just taking license. It was very easy for them to get license. So what happened next? So, the excessive regulation of what came to be called the permit license Raj prevented certain forms from becoming more efficient. So, at that particular time where people were misusing getting the license was very easy, right? So it was very easy for them to approach a person and get a license done and start a new business just to break the competition. So, what happened? There was a regulation that was implemented. It is called as Permit License Raj. So, here this prevented certain forms from becoming more efficient. Like, I want to cut down the business of XYZ who's producing the same products that I am producing. So I'll simply just go and start my business saying that I want to start the same business what he's doing. So what happens? People get confused with whom to buy, with from me or from the other person. So when people get confused, the sales will just go down from the actual XYZ, and people will start buying from me because I'm new to the market. So this becomes a competition, isn't it? So what happens? I start becoming more efficient. To cut down this happening, this situation, the permit license Raj was implemented. Due to the restrictions on imports, the Indian consumers had to purchase whatever the Indian producers produce. As we have spoken about import substitution, so the restrictions on imports happened. What happened after the restrictions of import? People were forced to buy whatever domestic production was happening, whatever the Indians had produced, that particular product only the Indians had to buy. They had no other choice. But what was the problem? It was posed in a high price. So the producers were aware that they had a captive market. Hence, they had no incentive to improve the quality of products. So, captive market, what is captive market? Come on, just give me a meaning of captive market quickly on my WhatsApp. Send it in the group, girls. Let's see how many of you will send me the correct answer. Okay. Then a few economists also pointed out that the public sector is not meant for earning profits but to promote the welfare of the nation. So, this was a main intention of the policy makers, that the public sector was introduced not only for the profit making but for the welfare of the economy. How was it helping the welfare? By giving the job opportunities, by utilizing the resources that is being produced. So all these things came into light. Hence, along with other problems, government introduced a new economic policy. So, with all these things, they had to consider a different policy to overcome all these barriers. So, let us come to a conclusion. What happened? So, the excessive regulation of, I'm sorry, okay, the progress of the Indian economy during the first seven plans was impressive indeed. Our industries were more diversified compared to the situation during the time of independence. Okay, so compared to the independence, during the time of independence and after the independence, the industrial sector started to develop and they had more stabilized form, and they started to produce lot number of products, manufacture lot number of products. So we need to thank the Green Revolution, land reforms, land sealing, which helped in the field of agriculture sector. So, as we all knew and know that agricultural sector was a major sector which produced revenue for our economy. So this that is these reforms, the Green Revolution, the land reforms, the land ceilings, all this encouraged for our better development of agricultural sector. Then our policies were inward oriented, and so we failed to develop a strong export sector. So they were mostly focused on the domestic development, just the development. They wanted to just develop, 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 and stabilize. So they didn't focus much on production. They didn't focus much on manufacturing of more number of products where they could export it. They were just doing self-sufficient. They were exporting and producing for the economy, which we were self-sufficient. We didn't have something that is in excess so that we could export it. So this became a drawback. So, the need for reform of economic policy was widely felt in the context of changing global economic scenario. And the new economic policy was initiated in the year 1991 to make our economy more efficient. So, with all these drawbacks, our economists felt there should be a new economic policies to be framed. And why was it? For a better economic scenario, they wanted to see a bright future for the economy. That was a major reason, and they wanted to have an efficient economy. With all this, they introduced a new economic policy, which we'll be seeing in the further chapters. So, for today, we are going to complete the second chapter, girls. Okay, here I conclude the second chapter. Any doubts, you please let me know. I will explain it to you. All right, for today, we are done with the second chapter. Okay, fine, girls, have a great day ahead. Please stay focused, stay home, stay safe, and complete your classworks. I've told you I will be checking your classwork. Yes, I'm going to call out randomly few girls' name and they will be presenting me the classwork. You get this from me? Be serious. Thank you so much.